One of the most infamous and prolific serial killers of the 20th century in Britain was known for his unique tendencies. What fueled his high victim count? Was it money or was it blood? It was reported that his distorted belief in being a vampire compelled him to irresistibly crave his victim's blood. Well, that's what he says. George Haigh's depravity extended beyond his peculiar motivations for the murders. His distinctive and unconventional method of disposing of the bodies earned him the moniker the acid bath murderer, when it was revealed that he would submerge the lifeless bodies of his victims in a bathtub and pour acid over them. Although that's not actually how he did it, well, at least he didn't use a bath. Haigh was an extremely dangerous man who was seen as a bit of a curiosity, as for no apparent reason other than what he had claimed drove him. They couldn't put him into a category, and that puzzled the psychologists. His parents were not absent. He had a decent upbringing and a reasonably normal social life, and there didn't seem to be any carnal motivation, unlike Christie. When comparing Haigh and Christie, the contrast between the two becomes strangely clear. When envisioning Christie, one cannot help but picture an unusual individual, a diminutive man with a soft yet unsettling tone to his voice. His sinister eyes, which held a dark and menacing gaze, fixated on his victims as they exhaled their final breaths, satisfying his twisted desires. The media focused on his pitiful demeanour, broadcasting his despicable actions for everyone to witness. In contrast, Haigh possessed a somewhat appealing character, an attractive man who carried himself with an air of sophistication. Pre-1949 he was known to the law as a minor criminal. He was soon to be known worldwide, with his crimes dominating the front pages. Finding factual information about Haigh's early life is challenging. He lacked close friends or supportive family members, and his parents opted not to discuss him. Consequently, the details that have been gleaned primarily originate from Haigh himself when he spoke to the media. As is typical of psychopaths, his self-representation aimed to present a more favourable version of his life. Haigh's parents were both from Yorkshire. John Robert Haigh and Emily Hudson were married in July 1898. John Sr. worked in the mining industry, and Emily came from a hard-working coal mining family. By 1901, the couple had moved to Sheffield, where Haigh Sr. worked as an engineer. A little while later, around 1902, they had moved to Lincolnshire, where Haigh Sr. worked hard and earned promotion. Haigh Sr. and Emily were a very religious couple and attended the Plymouth Brethren Meeting House, a nonconformist Christian house where like-minded people would meet. These beliefs, which were also followed by Haigh's grandparents, would be predominantly used by Haigh at his trial. Members were to live by moral standards rather than give in to desires, and to follow their beliefs rather than be influenced by others. Because of their beliefs, they saw themselves as superior to those outside of their faith. Later in life, Haigh's mother would say they despised the people in their village, as we thought we were God's elect. On July the 24th, 1909, John George Haigh was born at home in Stamford, Lincolnshire, and would remain an only child. About a year or so later, the family had moved back up north to Outwood, just north of Wakefield, where Haigh Sr. was now employed as a colliery engineer. They enjoyed a fairly comfortable life in a 5-bedroom terraced home. However, Haigh later criticised his experience there, describing it as extremely isolated and reminiscent of a monastic lifestyle. Haigh was quoted as saying that his deeply religious father would state that if he, Haigh Jr., wanted to go and meet someone or go somewhere, that it would displease the Lord. He was also quoted as saying that he was brought up on the Bible stories that mostly concentrated on sacrifices. He believed his father was so obsessed with removing himself and his family from the evils of the outside world. It was said by Haigh Jr. that his father built an 8-foot wall around his home to keep the outside world out, and spoke often of the worms that would eat his body when death came. Haigh felt it was inevitable that he would become morbidly obsessed with death. Haigh's parents adored their son, and he felt the same way about them. His father would often share how he saw his mother as an angel, untouched by Satan, while acknowledging his own past sin that had left him marked with a blue scar, symbolising his encounter with the devil. This scar on his father's forehead served as a constant reminder of a previous transgression. Haigh loved the thought of his mum being an angel, so he kept that image in his heart. As he grew older, the clash between two faiths intensified when he started attending Wakefield Cathedral. However, his attraction to the practices of cathedral worship grew stronger and stronger. However, after some time his belief in the Catholic Church became jaded when he began to see the clergy, ironically, as ambitious and politically minded, wanting earthly powers over truth and forgiveness. When Haigh's crimes came to light, those that knew him when he was growing up spoke of him being a mischievous child with a few friends, a bully who would also expose himself to unsuspecting schoolgirls. But he seemed to get away with almost anything. One newspaper wrote, "To his parents he was without blemish." He did not attend the local schools in Outwood. Instead, at the age of 7, he went to a preparatory school. His education was always private and funded by his parents. He attended a highly esteemed school, but struggled academically in some subjects and excelled in others. It was also while at school he learnt how to forge names and pick locks, which also got him the cane. He didn't like school, and his teachers gave him mixed reports, some claiming he was mischievous and others claiming he was charming and attentive. The two sides to his personality became apparent at an early age, but unfortunately not understood. He left school at the age of 17 in 1926, and after trying a couple of jobs, he settled into work at a garage in Wakefield. Although the owner thought him lazy, he found him charming, so kept him on. According to Haigh, while on holiday in London, he became fascinated with the neon lights used on the cinema buildings. He went on to work for a London firm where he installed neon electrical lighting for advertising products in York and Leeds. At the age of 20, he became active in the bedroom antics and dated more than one woman at a time. After some time, he grew weary of engaging in physical relationships, and the idea of contracting a disease disgusted him, just as the women did. In his own words, Haigh openly admitted to despising the act and believed it should only serve as a means to alleviate stress. He personally found solace in the act, feeling a greater connection to nature and God afterwards. However, the importance of the act diminished for him over time, and he grew to detest the occasional feelings of desire that arose, eventually resenting his partner for participating in such a sordid affair. He believed that God's way of procreation was wrong and that artificial insemination was the best solution. 1933 saw him working as a car insurance salesman. He worked hard, and although a bit of a loner, he seemed like a pleasant, amiable man to his colleagues and his customers. It was while here his passion for cars grew, collecting a few classic cars in his garage that he kept immaculately clean. It's thought that on his wages he wouldn't be able to afford such cars, and they were probably bought through ill-gotten gains, such as theft and fraud. His criminal tendencies were first noted in 1934, and he was fired from his insurance job for misconduct when it's believed he stole cash from a cash box. And once again we see the man who wanted more than he could afford, for the lifestyle he craved was financially out of his reach. What could he do? Well, he was a good worker, but the wages weren't enough. What else was he good at? Oh yeah, fraud. Along with his reasonably good looks and his ability to charm others, this, he believed, would help him move forward. Money was his motivation. In 1934, Haigh married the pretty blonde Beatrice Hamer at Bridlington Registry Office. Both Haigh and Hamer's parents didn't know about the marriage until after. Haigh's parents were disapproving of their son's new bride, supposedly due to her lack of religious beliefs and moral values. Similarly, the bride's family was unimpressed with their new son-in-law. The marriage, it was suggested, for Haigh was a convenient way for him to finally move out of his parents' home. It is possible, as back then it was the norm for children to live with their parents until marriage. They moved into a terraced house in Leeds, but the marriage didn't last long. We don't know what happened in the marriage, as Beatrice hardly spoke about it to anyone, but it's strongly believed that Haigh's criminal exploits at the time was the reason it ended. In 1934 he forged documents to defraud a company in Hull for £420, using another man's name. A little while later he repeated the same crime for the sum of £120. He tried this twice more on two other companies under other names, but wasn't successful. Haigh and his accomplices, Alice Rochhead and J. Lambert, was arrested on the 7th of November at Leeds City Petty Sessions. They were given bail and the trial was set for the 22nd of November. It was at a later date that the full extent of Haigh's crimes would come out. The three pleaded guilty. Once it became apparent that Haigh had used the other two, especially the woman Alice, they were fined and bound over. Haigh was given a 15-month prison sentence. While in prison he received a letter from the Brethren that seemed to shock and upset him, as they had been informed of his crimes and had decided to formally cut him off. Also, while he was incarcerated, poor Beatrice Haigh had to stay for a short time with Haigh's parents, as he hadn't made any arrangements for her before going into prison. In May 1935, Beatrice gave birth to a girl, Pauline Mary Haigh, at Leeds Maternity Hospital. Beatrice struggled after having her baby and felt there was nothing else she could do but have the child adopted. Haigh was let out of prison early for good behaviour on the 8th of December 1935. Beatrice and Haigh never saw or communicated with each other again. Just as a side note, Haigh and Beatrice never divorced, and Beatrice went on to marry twice, with her bigamy going unnoticed. On Haigh's release, he was set up to work in a dry cleaner's. Unfortunately, the part owner of the business died in an accident, and his wife didn't want to carry on with the firm, so it went into voluntary liquidation. Sometime in 1936, Haigh made his way to London and got a job working in an arcade. The owner, William McSwan, and Haigh got on very well and became close friends, but Haigh's ambitions were aimed at something more profitable. While living in Hammersmith, he taught himself law, well, enough for him to use when he needed it. His next decision was to defraud on a larger scale, using shareholding companies as a means to get money. It was quite a large-scale scam, but like before, it was discovered, and on the 23rd of November 1937, Haigh was brought before the courts at the County Hall, Kingston-upon-Thames, at the Surrey Assizes. He pleaded guilty to having obtained money by false pretences. The prosecutors at the trial said that Haigh had posed as a solicitor acting for the executors of deceased persons. He claimed he could sell shares cheaply to existing shareholders and gave an address for them to send a cheque as part payment. He then sent out papers with false names and addresses on it. A rightfully disgusted judge said it was one of the most terrible instances of fraud he'd seen so far and wanted to give Haigh a hefty sentence, but because Haigh was only 28, he was sentenced to 4 years penal servitude. Haigh didn't show any remorse. It was a game to him. If anything, he was quite proud of himself. He was in prison for the 23rd of November 1937 to the 13th of August 1940, serving the first part of his time in Wandsworth Prison. He was then transferred to Chelmsford Prison. Sometime between 1938 and April 1940, he was sent to Dartmoor. His release date was meant to be the 23rd of November 1941, but once again, due to good behaviour, he was released early. Side note, while he was in prison, he apparently spoke about taking lives, and if there was no body found, the person just simply disappeared. How would anyone know if a death had happened? It is also the first time we hear about the possibility of acid being used to dispose of a body. It's also possible through his constant use of the library in prison that he had read of this form of disposal. When the Luftwaffe blitz on London happened, Haigh, newly released from prison and now living in James's Street, London, joined as a fire watcher and was stationed at the Arts Display Services in Pimlico. As this employment was a reserved occupation, it meant that when Haigh was required to register for the armed forces, he wasn't required to enlist. During this period, Haigh, like many others, used the war as a distraction to continue his criminal activities. He found himself in and out of prison, often for larceny, started from around May 1941. In June he received a sentence of 21 months hard labour for committing a crime while on licence. He tried to appeal his sentence but failed. He was moved from Wandsworth to Chelmsford, ending up in Lincoln Prison, of which he hated, claiming it the worst prison he had ever been incarcerated in. But it's also here where he was designated to work in the tinsmith workshop, where sulphuric acid was easily available. It's been said that other prisoners would supply Haigh with mice for him to experiment with. It's presumed the mice were already dead and he would use the acid to dissolve them. Interestingly, he spent longer in prison this time, being released in September 1943. In the autumn of 1943, he was summoned before the medical board as a prelude to enlistment. He didn't turn up. Instead, he took himself to Crawley, a small town 28 miles from London and 18 miles from Brighton. After his last incarceration, Haigh had declared he wouldn't be locked up again and decided to try and make a living honestly. He got employed by a company, the Union Road Tool and Garage, to obtain quotes and orders. He came back to London in 1944 and seemed to have legitimate self-employment. He maintained a friendship with his former employer, Alan Stevens, whom he had been living with during his time of employment and often returned to Crawley to visit, in particular the 15-year-old daughter of Stevens and his wife. Haigh struck up a friendship with the young Barbara Stevens, taking her to the pictures, going out for drives, and while she attended Pitman's College, he would meet her and take her to a show after. Although Barbara was 19 years Hay's junior, they developed a close friendship that could possibly grow to something more. Barbara, no doubt, had deep feelings for Haigh, but it would seem he saw it as a brotherly relationship that could develop into more when she was older, but he wasn't sure. It would seem all the females in the family were enamoured with Haigh. He gave advice on hair, makeup and dress. In the words of one of the youngest women in the home, he was the most charming man I had ever met. He was kind and gentle, everything a man of culture should be. He's like a film star, always cheerful and well kept. She went on to praise him highly, remarking that he was always kind to people and animals. Barbara would add that he was always aware of his appearance and didn't like to leave the house without wearing something red. something Haigh couldn't explain. Whether it was symbolistic of something, he didn't know. It wasn't just his appearance he was strict with. He found loudmouths abhorrent. He didn't approve of beer. He disapproved of nightclubs and swearing. But if the need arose, he would tolerate the things he despised for his own gain. He seemed to be well liked in Crawley, probably because his past crimes and incarcerations were not known there. Back in London, Haigh, it would seem, had devised a way to obtain money without actually having to work. All he required was a wealthy person. After all, he possessed the ability to charm his way into their hearts. He could engage in conversation on various subjects to showcase his intelligence, flatter them with complete conviction, and make them feel loved and desired. And when they had served their purpose, he knew the perfect way to dispose of them, and nobody, he thought, would be any the wiser. March 1944 saw Haigh living at the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, where he made friends with a young blonde woman who was a member of staff. They met in secret as the hotel manageress didn't approve of the staff fraternising with guests. They went on walks and to the cinema, but more interestingly, they took a trip to Madame Tussauds, where Haigh took his time when they came to the George Joseph Smith exhibit. Smith had made the Chamber of Horror when he drowned 3 women in a bath for financial gain. This relationship was platonic, according to the young woman, who would go on to say that Haigh had formed a brotherly bond with her. Through all this time, Haigh had remained friends with William McSwan. Classed as an intelligent man, likeable but seemed lonely and a bit of a recluse, according to a family member. William's elderly parents owned a couple of properties and lived off the rent that those properties brought in. They didn't have the best quality of life and kept themselves pretty much to themselves. William McSwan would be Hay's first victim. In August 1944, Haigh rented 3 rooms off a Mr. Alfred Marshall, the rooms being in the basement of 79 Gloucester Road, which had an exit that led to Stanhope Mews, where it had a drain. Haigh was the occupier from the 6th of September. On the 7th, he placed an order by phone for 20 gallons of sulphuric acid, which arrived on the same day as it was ordered. On the 9th of September, according to Haigh, he invited McSwan to the basement rooms. In his own words, he hit McSwan over the head with a cosh, and he was dead within 5 minutes. He continued, "Eventually I stood up and was appalled at the presence of a corpse on my hands, but experienced no sense of remorse. I left the question of dealing with the corpse until the following day and went home to bed. I woke up and contemplated the action I had taken. I wondered how it is possible for me to have done something from which normally I would shrink. I returned to the basement and realised I must do something with the body. The question of disposal did not arise until after the event. Then the method seemed obvious. When I returned to the basement the next day, I had to find a drum big enough to put the body in. I discovered one in a churchyard, an old water butt that was used for air raid purposes. To transfer it back to the basement, I used a handcart I found in a builder's yard. I put McSwan in the barrel and then had to figure out how to get the acid out of the carboy. I had to do it by bucket. I wasn't prepared for the fumes and I was badly choked by them. I had to go outside for fresh air. Eventually the job was done and I left the basement, locking the door behind me. Subsequently, I returned to find the operation completely successful, and when the body had disappeared, I poured the sludge down the drain. If anything like teeth remain, they would now be down Barking Creek, or whatever it is that the London sewers flow into the sea. I felt no remorse after the killing. Haigh continued, and we have to remember this is his rendition of what happened. I took his watch and odds and ends, including an identity card, before putting him into the tank. I had known this McSwan and his parents for some time, and on seeing his mother and father, I explained that he had gone off to avoid his call-up. I wrote a number of letters in due course to his mother and father, purporting to be from him, and posted in, I think, Glasgow and Edinburgh, explaining the various details of the disposition of the properties which were to follow. Haigh would go on to empty William McSwan's bank account, and later in 1945 he sold McSwan's pin table business. Haigh was now a murderer. Gone were his days of petty crimes. Why, we don't know, but it would seem the lure of money was all too powerful for him to ignore, and he found it easy. It didn't faze him at all. He planned it and carried it out quietly and calmly, and this was all done for nothing more than financial gain. Another thing I found interesting, apparently, and because I'm no expert, serial takers of life don't usually kill for monetary reasons, and it's more than likely that other means rather than a cosh is used to take a life so they can watch the victim die a slow death. It's the act that excites them, not the thought of what they will gain from it financially. But Haigh wasn't interested in the act of killing, just what he could gain from it. As it stood, McSwan's father took over his business, and the properties were all in their names, so Haigh couldn't gain anything from his murder. Well, not straight away. As it would seem, Haigh had a plan. In October 1944, he part-rented the basement rooms with another man, Ronald Fontana. Fontana was told by Haigh that he needed the rooms for his experiments, and he remembered Haigh working on something behind locked doors. When he was asked by Haigh, Fontana told him where he could get large metal drums. Fontana left the basement property around May 1945, leaving Haigh as the sole tenant. In February 1945, he brought 3 carboys of sulphuric acid, each holding 10 gallons, and he waited. It wasn't until his lease was up in the summer that he had to put his plan into action. Around July the 2nd, he, in his own words, took McSwan Sr. and Mrs. McSwan to his basement rooms separately. He took their lives and disposed of them in the same way he had their son. According to Haigh, he used a cosh, but this time he claimed there was much blood. Coincidentally, an axe was given by Haigh to a Mr. Marshall, raising suspicions that he may have used the axe on the unsuspecting couple. Haigh's tenancy of the basement rooms ran out on July the 6th, 1945. What did he gain from the McSwan's death? Well, their ration books and identity cards, which allowed him to use the aforementioned ration books. Before selling the properties, he had letters sent out to the tenants claiming the rent was now to be paid to Haigh. There were some suspicions about this from some of the tenants, but nothing came of it. He ultimately sold the properties and McSwan Jr.'s business when he secured power of attorney for them. He sold off the furniture and emptied bank accounts. All of this combined earned him a substantial sum of money. Nobody, sadly, seemed to miss the McSwans. Some neighbours inquired as to why Haigh was emptying their flat, but he answered he had power of attorney and the McSwans had moved back to Scotland. It would also seem that the elder McSwan wasn't well liked. Claims that he was mean was mentioned by some. Although Haigh was seen as a curiosity, and in some ways he was, just like other serial life-takers, choosing his victims from those who unfortunately wouldn't be missed or little attention would be paid to their absence. And the McSwans fitted that category. Although it was for financial gain, he also needed to keep them from inquiring further about the disappearance of their son William. Now the war had ended, most people struggled in the aftermath, but Haigh had gotten away with murder and his bank account was full. Haigh kept in constant touch with Barbara Stevens and the Stevens family, visiting them on a regular basis. While in Crawley in 1945, he became friends with a Mr. Edward Jones, managing director of an engineering company, Hursley Products Limited. Haigh became an unpaid errand runner for the company in London, and with this he had been allotted a storeroom in a small two-storey building in Giles Yard, located on a quiet Leopold Road in Crawley. In August 1947, Haigh answered an ad for the sale of 22 Ladbroke Square, Chelsea, from Archibald and Rosalie Henderson. An asking price of £8,750 was offered, to which he offered £10,500 instead, but with no intention of purchasing the property. Haigh's intention was to connect with the couple, who it would seem had a rather questionable past themselves. Haigh's bank account was running low, as the money he had received from the McSwans had already been spent. He needed additional funds and set his sights on the Hendersons. Although he befriended the Hendersons, they were merely a means to an end for him. They grew fond of Haigh, but not everyone in their social circle felt the same way, especially Mrs. Henderson's brother, who thought him too slick. The Hendersons had their own problems. They liked to party and were financially struggling. Rosalie Henderson also threatened divorce because of her husband's heavy drinking. Although Haigh had witnessed the vicious arguments between the couple, it didn't bother him. After all, they meant nothing to him. He had already started his preparations. He brought the carboys of acid and kept them locked up in the storeroom in Crawley, along with a 40-gallon drum. This time he made sure he was a little more prepared than last time, taking a gas mask and gun from Archibald Henderson's home. In February 1948, the Hendersons were staying at the Metropole Hotel on the Brighton seafront. On the 11th, Haigh and Dr. Henderson got in a car and left the hotel. In Haigh's words, "I took Dr. Henderson to the storerooms on Leopold Road and shot him in the head. I placed him in the barrel of acid, as I had done the others. This was in the morning. I went back to the hotel and lured Mrs. Henderson to the storeroom by telling her husband was ill. I shot her and disposed of her in the acid. I took all of their valuables off them and sold them at Bull's in Horsham for around £300. I then took their belongings from the hotel and paid their bill." Haigh kept their red setter dog, Pat, for quite some time before giving him up because the dog had gone blind, so he handed him over to a Dr. Roland Byrne, who was an eye specialist. This, it was said, bothered him, as he liked the dog very much. Haigh went on to say, "I kept the relatives quiet by sending them letters from the rooms on Dawson Road that I acquired by forging the deeds of transfer. I then sold it to Mr. J.B. Clark." Detailing the deaths, he remarked he had left Archie and Rosalie trussed up like turkeys while he fetched the drums. He disposed of Archie first, then got another drum for Rosalie on the Saturday. When he went to dispose of the sludge, he noticed Archie's foot had not entirely dissolved, but he decided to leave it. And yet there is doubt about Haigh's rendition of this crime, as the police couldn't find anyone who heard a shot, and a dagger was found in the building, raising questions that this may have been the murder weapon. Later, and the reason for the murders, he moved forward with his plan. He managed to convince the manageress of the shop the Hendersons owned that he had been given permission on their behalf to collect the shop takings every week. He then collected the rent from the 2 apartments above the shop. They were suspicious, that's for sure, but he showed them forged documents claiming they were from the Hendersons. Rosalie's brother was very worried about his sister's disappearance, and Haigh knew he was a danger. When he spoke with Arnold Berlin, he assured him he was just looking after the Hendersons' affairs while they were away. Arnold arrived in London, intent on finding out what had happened to his sister and her husband. Haigh took him to his sister's apartment, where he noted the luggage that had been returned from the Brighton Hotel. They then went for dinner. Haigh was adamant that he didn't know where they had gone. The Hendersons' passports had been left in their home, but little attention was paid to it. Later, on the 1st of March, Arnold had called Haigh and informed him that if he hadn't heard anything in the next few days, he would contact the police. Haigh had to do something and typed a letter claiming it was from Rosalie. In the letter he mentioned that after a big argument, she and Archie made the mutual decision to take some time away. This came about after he expressed thoughts of taking his own life when she mentioned the possibility of leaving him. Their primary goal was to work on saving their marriage, which led them to choose to spend time away to work on things. Although this letter helped calm Arnold for a time, he once again mentioned to Haigh that maybe they should go to the police, and Haigh managed to talk him out of it. But Arnold did talk to a friend of his, a detective sergeant in the Stockport police. As soon as Haigh heard this, a telegram, allegedly from Rosalie, arrived the next day stating, "Going to Scotland tonight. We'll contact you Tuesday or Wednesday. Rosie." After this, more letters arrived that seemed to quell the brother's concerns just a little, and he kept in contact with Haigh, who, he would later say, didn't seem to be worried at all. Arnold Berlin moved forward with his life. He got married and had a child, but he thought of his sister constantly. Haigh went on to take possession of the Hendersons' apartment, shop and car, and would eventually sell them. From the 12th of February to the 30th of July, Haigh continued to use the Hendersons' money, cashing forged cheques in their names and selling off their possessions. Haigh continued to live luxuriously and frequently took Barbara on outings. He shared stories about the Hendersons with her and even sold some of Rosalie's dresses. Later on, he informed her that the Hendersons had relocated to South Africa. Meanwhile, back in London at the Onslow Hotel, a friendship had been formed between Miss Diana Eden and Haigh. Miss Eden, a 29-year-old woman of means, lived at the hotel. They had known each other for about 2 years, from 1945 to 47. She found Haigh good company, as did Miss Hazel Hinks of Swan Court and Kathleen Murray, who had worked at the Onslow Hotel. Another employee of the hotel, Margaret Moran, also found him good company. There were others, as it was obvious he enjoyed surrounding himself with young women. But it wasn't just the women who succumbed to his charms. It would seem that anyone he came close to were enamoured with him. He had the knack of ingratiating himself with their families. It wouldn't take Haigh long to gamble away the Hendersons' money. So towards the end of 1948, after spending a pleasant Christmas at the Onslow and enjoying the company of Barbara over the New Year, Haigh found himself in need of cash once again. Haigh had now killed 5 people with no suspicion around their disappearance and certainly no bodies to be found. What was to stop him doing the deed again? 1949 saw Mrs. Olive Henrietta Helen Olivia Robarts Duran Deacon having the unfortunate luck to come into contact with Haigh, an intelligent woman and a former suffragette. In fact, she was a very active member for women's rights. Olive also resided at the Onslow Hotel and had a close female friend who also lived at the hotel, Mrs. Constance Lane. Olive also kept in touch with her sister, Esme Fargus. Haigh had already laid down foundations with the widow, worming his way into her life. How was not really known, but he had the gift of charm, so it's no surprise really. Haigh had already devised his dastardly plan. After paying a visit to Crawley and borrowing money from Mr. Jones, he began obtaining the materials he needed for his new venture, which he had told Mr. Jones was the manufacturing of false nails. His list of items needed was a metal drum, acid, pump, gloves, apron, rags, cotton wool and red paper. Back at the hotel, Haigh and Olive were often seen dining together and chatting. Nobody saw anything untoward of this. It wasn't anything unusual. They became close friends, and Olive even corresponded with his parents, who she knew he was close to. It was heard that she thought of Haigh as an infinitely kind, considerate and generous young man. Haigh was getting desperate by now. After paying his hotel bill with the money he had borrowed, he asked another acquaintance, Mr. Davis in Crawley, when he would next be going to London on business, as he needed him to pick up some acid. Mr. Davis obtained an empty carboy from the Leopold Road storeroom so they could fill it the next day when he went to London on business. On the 17th of February, Haigh visited his friend Mr. Jones's factory, where he asked him if he would make some adjustments to the stirrup pump he had, so the acid would pump from the barrel into the drum. When Davis returned with the 10 gallons of acid, he asked why Haigh needed so much of it. Haigh replied it was a secret. On the 18th, Haigh obtained a new drum and helped Jones with taking some steel to his factory. Haigh then obtained the keys to the storeroom on Leopold Road. Haigh returned to London and entered the Onslow Hotel. Mrs. Durand Deacon was last seen talking to her friend Constance, where she told her she had an appointment with Mr. Haigh, who was going to show her where he did all his experiments. The information from Haigh about a murder can only be taken as his word, but there is no reason to doubt it, I guess. In his words, we left the hotel together and drove to Crawley in my car. She was inveigled into going to Crawley with me, in view of her interest in artificial nails. Having taken her in the back of the storage room at Leopold Road, I shot her in the back of the head while she was inspecting some paper for use as fingernails. Following that, I removed the coat she was wearing, a Persian lamb, and the jewellery, rings, necklace, earrings and a cruciform, and put her into a 45-gallon tank. He then left to visit Jones before setting off back to the storeroom. He was then seen going to and fro from the shed to the car. He went to eat, and according to the proprietor of the Ye Old Ancient Prize restaurant, he was in a light-hearted mood and mentioned he had a long journey ahead. Haigh, on returning to the shed, realised his mistake when he noticed he hadn't locked the door when he left. He donned his protective clothing and carried on with the next stage. In his words, I then filled the tank up with sulphuric acid by means of a stirrup pump from the carboy to the tank. I then left it to react. I brought the jewellery and gun to the car and left the coat on the bench. I went to the George for dinner. I know it was late, about 9 p.m. He continued. I then went back to town and returned to the hotel about 10:30 p.m. I put the revolver back into the square hat box. Before I put the handbag into the tank, I removed the cash, about 30 shillings, and a fountain pen, and kept these, and tipped the rest into the tank with the bag. Haigh later said the procedure of disposal had become very automatic by then. I am not aware of remorse. I find it would be true to say I had no reaction at all. I was numb to it. It is a fatiguing business getting a 14-stone carcass into an oil drum on one's own. It took me 2 hours to get Mrs. Durand Deacon into the drum. I'm not a strong man, and in the manner of these disposals accomplished something which normally I wouldn't be capable of, through lack of strength to do so. Due to Mrs. Durand Deacon having many friends and relatives that visited her, as well as her finances being in good order, Haigh claimed her death wasn't for financial gain. When Haigh returned to the hotel the next day, he inquired from Henrietta's good friend Constance if she had seen Mrs. Durand Deacon, as she hadn't shown up where they had arranged to meet the day before. This alarmed Constance, and she said she would inquire further at the hotel. Haigh then did no more than go straight to the jeweller's in Horsham, where he asked for a valuation of some jewellery, giving a false name and address. He drove back to Crawley to check on the drum, and in his words, I called in to see how the reaction was going. It was not satisfactorily complete. Haigh then spent an afternoon with Barbara before handing in Henrietta's Persian coat at the cleaners. Henrietta's good friend Constance was very concerned for her friend's safety, and oddly Haigh suggested they go to the police, to which she agreed. At Chelsea Police Station, the on-duty police officer, PC Leonard Dale, made a note of what they had to say. Mrs. Lane did most of the talking, he said, with the occasional appeal to Mr. Haigh as corroboration. The PS assured Mrs. Lane that every possible inquiries would be made, to which Haigh then responded, "You have written down Mrs. Lane's news, but you haven't asked me for mine. I think you ought to take it." Many inquiries were made, and a description of the missing woman was distributed. When the description was placed in newspapers, they mentioned Haigh's name. In the meantime, on the 21st of February, WPS Alexander Lambourne visited the Onslow Hotel to talk with Mrs. Lane and Haigh. The WPS took an instant dislike to Haigh, stating that she found him suspicious, stating she didn't like his mannerisms, as they gave her a sense of him being a wrong-'un, and that there may be a case behind this whole business. It was also on the 21st that Haigh went back to Crawley to check on how the reaction was going. On this occasion, while filling his car with petrol, the garage owner remarked about seeing him with a woman in his car a few days before. A shook Haigh denied it was him and took off. WPS Lambourne reported her findings to Detective Inspector Albert Webb. He and DeRose went to the Onslow and spoke with the manageress, who informed them that Haigh, although sometimes late paying his bill, seemed like a decent man. After they left, they were both convinced they had a murder case on their hands. Detective Chief Inspector Shelley Symes, who had accompanied Neville Heath back from London, was given the information. He immediately told Webb to go back to the hotel and talk to Haigh. DeRose quickly searched Haigh's apartment and found some paperwork belonging to the Hendersons and the McSwans. Meanwhile, back at Scotland Yard, Haigh's previous criminal convictions came to light and a full-scale investigation into George Haigh began. At around 9 p.m. on the 21st, Webb and Symes met Haigh as he arrived back at the hotel and asked him what he might know regarding Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance. He made his first of 5 statements. "I am a married man, but have not seen my wife since 1935. I have lived at the Onslow Court Hotel for the past 5 years. I am an engineer and a director of Hursley Products Limited of Crawley, Sussex, a firm of light engineers. I usually go down there about once or twice a week. I am a patentee and have interests in various inventions. I have known Mrs. Durand Deacon as another resident of the hotel for the past 3 years or so. She always sat at the next table to me and we generally talked. We got quite friendly." On the 14th, 15th or 16th of February 1949, Mrs. Durand Deacon spoke to me about an idea she had for a new type of artificial fingernail. She showed me some she had made with paper and had glued to her nails. She asked me if I could make something similar, which could be sold. I remember now that it was during lunch on the 14th of February that this subject was first mentioned, because the secretary of the Bacon Society was there at the time. On the following Tuesday or Wednesday, I told Mrs. Durand Deacon that I thought I could do something about the fingernails, and suggested that she come down to the factory at Crawley to show us what she wanted. I did not fix a definite appointment then, but said it would be probably Friday. At breakfast time on Friday the 18th of February, I saw Mrs. Durand Deacon and told her I would see her again at lunch and let her know about the appointment. I saw her again at 10 minutes to 2. In the meantime, I'd been to Crawley and arranged for some unloading of some steel sheeting. I told my partner, Mr. Jones, to expect me back in the afternoon with the lady who was interested in the fingernails. I told Mrs. Durand Deacon at 10 minutes to 2 that if she was agreeable that we would go down to Crawley that afternoon. She said she would, and I said I would be ready for her at 2:30. I then went downstairs, and when I came down about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour afterwards, Mrs. Durand Deacon was sitting at the porter's desk. She says, "Can we go down to the Army and Navy stores to pick up some samples of existing types of artificial nails?" I said, "Yes, but I am not ready now because I had not had my lunch." She said, "Well, I will go down to the Army and Navy stores and get them. You will meet me at the first entrance on the front, coming from this end at 2:30. She got up and went into the street. She was dressed in a black cloth hat and black astrakhan coat. She was carrying a small red plastic handbag about 9 inches by 5. She was wearing a brass crucifix about 5 inches long on a chain around her neck. This was the last time I saw her. I went to the Army and Navy store, reaching there about 3:20. I had to take the car. I parked it at the back of the stores between 2 mail vans. I walked round to the front but could not see anything of Mrs. Durand Deacon. I waited till nearly 3:30, and as she did not arrive I went to Crawley alone. I got there about 4:25 and attended to some business with some small fans we were making. I had my dinner at about 6:30 at the Ancient Prior Cafe in Crawley. I left there just before 7 and returned to the hotel just before 8. A known lie. I went straight to my room. I cannot remember whether I came down again that night. I do remember now that I came down again about 9:45 to see if Mrs. Lane was in the Tudor lounge, but she was not. The following morning when I came down to breakfast, the waitress asked me if Mrs. Durand Deacon was ill, as she had not been down to dinner the previous night. I said I did not know, and then I went to ask Mrs. Lane what she knew about Mrs. Durand Deacon. When I told her she had not kept her previous appointment, Mrs. Lane then went upstairs to inquire if Mrs. Durand Deacon was unwell. She came down immediately afterwards and told me she hadn't been in all night. She did not come back on Saturday, so on Sunday the 20th of February 1949 I went with Mrs. Lane to the Chelsea police station and reported her missing. After signing the statement, he returned to Crawley to give Jones the money back he had borrowed. He apologised for the late repayment and asked if he would take a little less, and he would give him the rest later when he had it. He then went back to the storeroom to check on the reaction. When finding it complete, he disposed of the sludge. He then returned to Horsham to sell the jewellery, wanting £100, but only got £60 on that day, as that was all they had in the till at the time. The remaining £40 was paid later. He repaid some of his debts for the £60. He returned to Crawley and met a disgruntled Jones, who asked Hay if he was in any trouble with the police, as he'd been visited by them. Jones told Hay, if he was, not to come back to the factory, as he wanted nothing to do with any trouble. Hay laughed and denied he was involved in any trouble. After staying the night in Crawley, he went back to London, where the police paid him another visit at the hotel on Thursday the 24th of February, where they asked for a second statement following subsequent inquiries. Hay's second statement. I went to Crawley in the morning of the 18th of February 1949 and brought a bowl back with me, and I have it in my room. I arrived at the hotel about 1:55 p.m. and I left my car in front of the hotel by Manson Place. I spoke to Mrs. Durand Deacon in the Tudor lounge, and I asked her if that afternoon was all right for her to go down to Crawley. She replied yes. I said I would be ready at 2:30. I left her and went upstairs. In about 15 minutes I came back and she was sitting by the porter's desk, i.e. on the seat by the stamp box. It looked as if she was waiting for me and was ready to go out. As far as I can remember, there was no porter there. I spoke again to Mrs. Durand Deacon in reply to a question she asked me, which was, could we go down to the Army and Navy stores in order to collect some samples of artificial fingernails. I said I had not had any lunch, and she said she would go down and pick them up herself. I agreed and went and had my lunch. Mary, the waitress, served me, and I am sure I ate it in 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. I left the hotel to pick up Mrs. Durand Deacon, and I am sure Mrs. Kirkwood, the cashier, saw me go. I kept the appointment at the Army and Navy stores, waited an hour, and then went to Crawley. I did not ring the hotel to find out why Mrs. Durand Deacon had not kept the appointment, or if she had returned. It did not occur to me. I should say I spent 3/4 of an hour with Jones at Crawley on the second visit that day, because we were discussing the belts for the toy soldier machines. He was very upset over outstanding accounts and having to put his staff off. I think I went into the Prior's for dinner about 5:30 p.m. It was the first time I had eaten there for about 3 years. The owner did not know me. I spoke to him and we discussed ages. He remarked about my car outside, and as I left I spoke to a man who has a garage in the Ifield Road near the fire station. He knows me by sight. When I reached the hotel that evening about 8 p.m, I asked Draper, the porter, if Mrs. Durand Deacon was in, and he said he did not know. I looked for Mrs. Lane, but did not see her, and then went upstairs. I came down about 9:45 p.m. with a view to asking Mrs. Lane if she had seen Mrs. Durand Deacon, but she was not there. I draw no wages from Hersey Products, although I am a director. I buy and sell engineering machinery and tools, and I could supply a detailed list of these transactions. I also back dogs and horses. I won £50 over Cavalry Major at White City on Saturday, and 300 over Black Tarquin last year. This statement has been read to me as true. After his second interview, the two police officers discussed Hay's replies. To which Webb asked DeRose, "Well, what do you think of that?" DeRose replied, "I think he killed the old lady." Once they'd given the information to the superintendent, the case moved forward. D.S. Patrick Heslin of the Sussex Police contacted Jones to accompany him to the storeroom in Giles Yard. When there, Heslin had to force the doors open, as Hay still had the keys. Heslin noted what he saw. I saw a large square-shaped leather case on the table in the corner of the room. I also saw 3 acid carboys in the centre of the room. There was a stirrup pump to the left of the room and a rubber apron. There was also a mackintosh and rubber gloves. Later in the day, Heslin would return to the storeroom to collect a leather hat box and a leather suitcase that contained the revolver and an envelope with bullets inside. He found a ticket from the dry cleaners and retrieved the Persian coat, which would be confirmed as hers by her sister and friend. They also discovered the passports, identity cards and ration books that belonged to the McSwans and Hendersons. Mrs. Durand Deacon's room at the hotel was searched by Symes, and after the jewellers had read about the unfortunate Mrs. Durand's disappearance and saw Hay mentioned in the article, they contacted the police and gave them the jewellery they had bought from Hay. Hay was taken into the police station on the 26th of February. He made his third statement, where he stated what was in the 2 cases the police had found. He gave details telling how he had met the Hendersons. He claimed they had sold the premises they owned to him, and he had resold them. He claimed he had remained friends with the Hendersons before they had departed for South Africa in 1948. He also claimed he had been asked to take their luggage that had been left at the Brighton Hotel to their property on Dawes Road. He went on to say he didn't know what was in the case as it was locked. The other case was his, and it contained ration books, clothing coupons and a cleaning ticket for a fur coat that belonged to Mrs. Henderson. He claimed the ration books that belonged to the McSwans were left to him when they left for Africa in 1944 or 45. For some reason, they let Hay go. When the newspapers published the latest information about the missing Durand Deacon and the individuals connected to her disappearance, it triggered associations with other missing person cases among certain readers. Apparently, the news media besieged Hay and others, and it would seem Hay was enjoying the attention, but chose carefully who he spoke to. Mr. Berlin, Mrs. Henderson's brother, had read the news that had included Hay's previous criminal acts and called Hay wanting to know more. After he got off the call, he was in no doubt something bad had happened to his sister and her husband, so he called the police. On the 28th of February 1949, John Haigh was taken to the Chelsea police station by Webb. It was noted at the time that Haigh was outside the hotel with his car and his suitcases were packed and sitting in the hotel lobby. Haigh was left waiting at the station for Superintendent Barrett and Detective Inspector Symes, who were driving back from Crawley. In the interview room were Symes, Webbs and Barrett. When Haigh was asked to answer some questions, he replied that he would do anything to help. When asked about Mrs. Durand Deacon's coat and jewellery, he admitted to having sold the jewellery and that the coat did belong to the lady. When asked why he had it, he claimed it was a long story about blackmail. Symes and Barrett left the room on hearing this, and Webb, who had been left with Haigh, sat and listened to him. When I asked where the other officers had gone, he told him, "They're probably trying to figure out if you'll hang." Haigh then replied, "What on earth for?" It became apparent to Webb that Haigh was under the impression that if there was no body, they couldn't convict, and that there was no proof he had taken someone's life. This subject was discussed between the two men. Webb reminded him that there were 6 people he was connected to that had mysteriously disappeared, so it wasn't looking good for him, and he was facing a very difficult situation. Haigh began asking what he should do, to which Webb responded, "I can't tell you what to do, only that holding back on information isn't going to help, and your only defence would be insanity." When asked by Haigh what would happen to someone if they were found insane, Webb told him once they were found guilty but insane, they wouldn't hang but would be sent to Broadmoor. And all Haigh could think of was maybe there's a possibility he would be released from Broadmoor. Haigh then told Webb, "Those people who disappeared no longer exist. No trace of them will ever be found. The truth of it is fantastical, so much so you won't believe it." Haigh was cautioned before continuing. "I will tell you the truth of it. Mrs. Durand Deacon no longer exists. She has disappeared and no trace of her will ever be found. I have destroyed her with acid. You will find the sludge which remains at Leopold Road. Every trace has now gone. How can you prove a life has been taken without a body?" Webb left the room to inform the others what had been told. When all 3 returned to Haigh, he told them it was true, but he would like to talk with Webb and only Webb, as they were having a lovely chat. When Webb and Haigh were once alone again, Haigh told him about his crimes. Webb recalled Symes and Barrett, and a formal written statement was made. He told them all about Mrs. Durand Deacon, the McSwans and the Hendersons, how he disposed of the bodies and how he sold items and properties that belonged to them. Most shockingly was the claim he made that he had drunk the blood of his victims, and this was his motive. In his words, after taking Mrs. Durand Deacon's life, "Then I went out and fetched in a drinking glass and made an incision, I think with a penknife, in the side of her neck, and collected a glass of blood, which I then drank." Of the younger McSwan, he recalled that he withdrew a glass of blood from his throat as before and drank it. Finally, as to the other 4, "In each of the last 4 cases I had a glass of blood as before." The claim came as a shock to the police officers, leaving a lasting impression. One of the officers even took a long sip of scotch to process the information. Was this just a ploy to claim insanity? As there were no bodies to examine, all they could do was take his word. Now, vampires were not as popular back then, but there were books by well-known authors that he could have read, and in the 1920s there was a story about a German serial life-taker who claimed to have drunk their victim's blood. Haigh was then taken to Horsham Police Station on the 2nd of March and formally charged with the murder of Mrs. Durand Deacon on the 18th of February 1949. He was remanded at the Magistrates' Court until the 11th of March, as there were more inquiries to be made that may result in more charges. On searching Haigh's hotel room, they found many items belonging to the victims. There were files concerning both the McSwans and the Hendersons, and a list of all the things he needed to dispose of Mrs. Durand Deacon. They visited the former properties of the McSwans and discovered they hadn't been seen since they went away with Mr. Haigh, recalled a neighbour. A thorough search was conducted at 79 Gloucester Road, with attention given to both the cellar and the rest of the property. During the search, 2 carboys were found, along with various other items such as a rubber apron, a gas mask, mackintosh and rubber gloves. Additionally, an acid sample was taken from one of the carboys. To further aid in the investigation, soil and sludge samples were collected and blood specks were observed on the walls. On March the 4th, Webb went to Lewes Prison to collect another statement from Haigh. In this statement, Haigh claimed to have killed 3 others in the same way as they already mentioned. 2 at 79 Gloucester Road and 1 more at Crawley. Any other bodies found were nothing to do with him. There is absolutely no evidence the other 3 people mentioned even existed at all, so it's been concluded that Haigh made them up along with the vampire references to solidify his claims of insanity. By now, Haigh had come to an agreement with the News of the World newspaper, where they would pay his defence costs and they would get a world exclusive. Interestingly, the editor of the Mirror newspaper was taken to court by Haigh's solicitors and found £10,000 and did 3 months in the same jail as Haigh for printing a story that was considered to be in contempt of court and that may prejudice the jury. Further searches were carried out with more and more items being found. The forensic team were kept busy with so much evidence being gathered, especially from the sludge that had been collected. Human remains were found, some bone pieces and dentures that were identified as Mrs. Durand Deacon's by her dentist. One of the doctors working on the forensics, a Dr. Simpson, wrote, "So much for Haigh's claim that every trace had gone." Dr. Holden examined some items from the storeroom and found bloodstains on the gas mask and apron, also on the cuff of one of Haigh's shirts on Mrs. Durand Deacon's fur coat, and a penknife found in Haigh's car. Dr. Turfer examined the revolver, finding it had been fired recently. Body fats and traces of acid were found on the mackintosh, rubber gloves and a wooden rod. Through all of this, he kept in constant communication with his parents and Barbara. The love they had for him and him for them was obvious from the letters they wrote to each other. They also showed his narcissistic traits. In one letter to Barbara, he claimed his love for her and asked why she would ask why he hadn't taken her life, claiming what they had was separate to the others, stating there was no affection involved. As for his parents, they decided not to visit their son, and he didn't want them to see him in the prison. They kept a low profile and rarely left their home. Dr. Snell, medical officer at Wormwood Scrubs, interviewed Haigh 3 times to determine sanity. He found there was no mental abnormality in the family. He found him vain, conceited and egocentric. In conclusion, he determined Haigh was of sound mind and had not suffered from such disease of the mind as would prevent him from knowing what he was doing, and that it was wrong. It was in his opinion that he was fit to plead and stand trial. At 10:30 a.m. on July the 18th, Haigh's trial began at the County Hall, Lewes, Sussex Assizes, in front of Judge Travis Humphreys. The counsel for the Crown was led by Attorney General Sir Hartley Shawcross. The defence led by Maxwell Fyfe. The clerk of the court made the formal announcement. John George Haigh, you stand charged that you, on the 18th day of February of this year in this county, murdered Olive Henrietta Helen Olivia Roberts Durand Beacon. How say you upon this indictment? Are you guilty or not guilty? Haigh immaculately turned out in the dock pleaded not guilty. The evidence was brought forward, the witnesses questioned, the doctors on both sides gave their thoughts and conclusions on Haigh's sanity or lack of, with the latter being heavily relied on by the defence. Dr. Yellowlees, for the defence, thought his strict, lonely religious childhood was responsible for his mental instability, and when he was younger he was involved in an accident where blood from a cut on his head dropped into his mouth, giving him a taste for the blood. When cross-examined by Shawcross, I'm not asking you whether the man decided in obedience to a higher power to do what he realised was wrong. I'm asking you to look at the facts and tell the jury whether there is in any doubt that he must have known that according to English law he was preparing to do and subsequently had done something which was wrong. I will say yes to that if you say punishable by law instead of wrong. Punishable by law and therefore wrong by the law of this country. Yes, I think he knew that, replied the doctor, implying Haigh knew what he was doing was wrong. Shawcross also pointed out that the doctor had only visited Haigh 3 times, not 5 as he claimed, and in total spent only 2 hours with him. Fife, after trying to regain credibility for the doctor, stated, "That is all the evidence I desire to call, my lord." After the closing speeches, the jury retired. 17 minutes later, they returned with a verdict. "Members of the jury, do you find the prisoner John George Haigh guilty or not guilty of taking Mrs. Durand Deacon's life, or do you find him guilty but insane?" "Guilty of taking her life," the foreman responded. The judge then condemned Haigh to hang. Haigh was taken to Wandsworth Prison on the 19th of July 1949. On the 10th of August, Haigh was hanged by Albert Pierpoint and his body buried in the grounds. A crowd of around 500 people stood outside the prison, waiting for the official notice to be placed on the prison doors. Barbara remained loyal to Haigh, claiming she loved him but despised what he had done. His devoted parents went to their grave full of love for their son. The News of the World published his memoirs in them. He included his love of animals, especially Pat the red setter. He wrote of his love of cars and the taking of the lives of his victims, including the drinking of blood, which he gave graphic details of. John George Haigh didn't show any remorse for his victims and despised the term used for him and his crimes. In his words, the word murder is most unpleasant. It makes me wince. It implies a brutal and savage killing, done in cold blood and entailing suffering. He preferred the term killed. Thank you for watching.